So welcome to this is really a mishmash. I mean, this title, Judea, Capta, Rav Yeshua, and the icons of Beit Nattif, is a partial summary of what I have in here. There's no one container for the subject, but basically what I'm doing here is looking at some disregarded or forgotten corners, mostly disregarded, of the history. I mean, here we are in December and there's Christmas, and the whole development of Christianity has really overlooked the I can't even say the Judaic roots because Christianity is a different religion. I've taken to calling it Paulianity because it is not the teachings of Yeshua of Nazareth. I mean, it has some of the teachings in it, but the doctrine is not Judaic, and he was a Judaic rabbi. So I'm going to talk about some of that and a little bit of critique also of the misappropriations of symbolism and some of this, the difficulty is there's not images for a lot of these subjects. So I'm first going to share with you images that we can talk about. And then we're going to go over to the chapter reading. And I don't know how many of you actually read the reading from experience, not very many. So I can't obviously cover in this time span all of the chapter, but I'm going to pick out parts of it to look at and discuss. So that's the schedule, and I'm struggling here with my windows. Okay, so so let's just go into it. I want to start with these maps because all of this is pretty much terra incognita to most people. And to just, where we're talking about. And as I study this more, the more I look at it, the more I realize how this is all, our knowledge of this is so structured by Christian narratives or even, narratives about Israel as a state, in ancient times. But you can see here there are regions. So there's Judea here in the southern region, Samaria, the Samaritans, that's their region. Mount Gerizim is their sacred mountain. And the temple for them is there and not here in Jerusalem. And then the Galilee. But the Jordan River running all along through here, this area is now in Jordan, named after the river. But in ancient times, this was all much more malleable because when you have a river, usually both sides of the river, tend to be, I mean, rivers can be borderlands, but historically they weren't. And there's some very interesting scholarship in the last 40 years, especially, that talks about, the various tribes of various tribes of Israel settling on the other side of the river, and we'll get into all of that. The Nabateans are here, and this whole region in ancient times was called Edom, and later on the Romans call it Idumea. But the desert region south of Judea was not ethnically Jewish for most of the history. And so there's a lot of different angles to this to cover. But I just wanted to show you, like here, Jerusalem, Bethlehem in Hebrew, Bethlehem in Arabic, and Hebron. These are some key areas. We're going to mention Lydda here. I just wanted to give you some kind of a context for that, but especially when we get to the end of the show and we talk about the icons of Beit Nattif, this region, the influences of basically Jordanian or even Arab populations are very much part of that picture. So I'm just putting this in here. This is earlier, the famous goddess icons, pillar goddesses, various names given to them from the Iron Age. So after the year 1000, from about 900 to about 500, these are all over the place in ancient Israel, Palestine. And the gesture of the hands to the breast goes along with something that's across the entire part of Southwest Asia. From like about 10,000 BCE, you begin to already start seeing these female icons appearing. But what's interesting here, and I'm going to be talking a lot about continuities, is the mold-made heads. So handmade, probably by the women, clay figures, and they would attach these terracotta heads to them. And so these mold-made figurines are something in this time period, in the late Iron Age, well, even in the Bronze Age, you begin to see them. And what we see here, we can see some very Hellenistic stuff. In our time range, we're looking at basically the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, Common Era, right? And so there are some of very archaic type. There are some that look Phoenician. There's a lot of Hellenistic stuff because first the Greeks, the Macedonians technically, and then the Romans conquer this region. but there's a continuity of its own, a native continuity of styles, and I'm going to be getting into that. With Judaism, there's a lot more than we have been shown because there's a lot of influence from other cultures, and you do see, there's not supposed to be any graven images, right, according to Torah. But you hear in Gaza, we have maybe Ezekiel in his chariot, in the Merkabah, the winged chariot that he ascends to heaven with. It's inscribed Yahoo right here. And we even see in this southwest region a pairing of the goddess Ashtart with Yah. And so this name Yah actually penetrates into the pagan world and is appearing on amulets and various kinds of inscriptions, magical charms. There's this fusion that happens in this late period of Judaism with the Chaldean oracles and all kinds of magical papyri in Egypt. There's a huge Jewish community in northern Egypt. So there's this ferment going on. But what's interesting about this pairing is it points all the way back to the 10th century in Israel itself, where you have inscriptions to Yah of Shomron, basically Yah of Samaria, and his Asherah. And then there's another inscription that is similar to that. So pairing the Hebrew god with a female partner, something that in Islam was highly forbidden, and it wasn't really supposed to happen in Judaism either. And there was huge controversy over the existence of a Hebrew goddess. In the late 20th century, they finally had to break down and admit, well, in fact, there are these inscriptions, there is this iconography, we have to look at this. But, up till then, the doctrinal religious view said, well, no, Israel has always been monotheistic. As you can see, there are all these sub-communities where that's really not the case. And Ashkelon and Ashdod are sort of on that lower southern strip, Mediterranean strip, and also have like a very pagan history. So this is in the Hellenistic period. The Greeks have kind of taken over, but you have Isis appearing and in her Hellenistic form, and we see Demeter and other forms. And even just at Ashkelon, it was famous, Ashdod, were cities of the goddess Atargatis. At that time, that was called Philistia. This is where the name Palestine comes from, Palestine was an area that was settled probably by Mycenaeans in the period just before the great collapse of the late Bronze Age. So there's lots of different things going on. But in the period we're looking at, this region of Israel, Samaria, and Judah is caught between the Syrian Empire of the Seleucids, which rules much of Asia, and the Ptolemaic Empire. And these are all founded by the generals that followed Alexander the Conqueror. So these imperial forces. And the Maccabees, we're going to talk about them, the Jewish uprising to take back territory that had been dominated by empires for centuries. So the Seleucids were Hellenized Syrians, and they imposed their foreign deities. There was attempts, attacks on the temple in Jerusalem. And you have Jupiter, or as we see here, some goddess, being toppled in the successful revolt. So it's really a mixture for those of us who are oriented toward goddess veneration, yay goddess, but on the other hand, foreign domination putting things in, not great. So, there's a complexity to all of this. And I really sort of ignored all of this history, but I kind of did a deep dive in it as I've been researching this chapter too, because the Hasmonean dynasty was founded by the Maccabees. And these were Jewish rebels who fought back against the Seleucid Empire and succeeded in overthrowing it, at least for a time. And so they're called the Hasmonean. Nava could tell us. Ashmonaim, I don't know exactly how you say it in Hebrew. This is one of their coins.
Ashmonaim, yeah, you're saying it right.
Oh, thanks. Okay, yeah. So there becomes an independent kingdom. And I spent entirely too much time trying to put together this genealogy because I discovered a very interesting figure here. So here's the Maccabees, and then the son of Mattathias, who ends up founding the Hasmonean dynasty, Shimon, and then his son Yohanan, or John, they'll call him sometimes. He has several sons, both of whom marry this woman. In Hebrew, she's called Shlomtzion, and she's a sister of Simeon ben Shetach, who is like one of the primary figures of the Pharisees. He's like a foundational figure in rabbinical Judaism. But she's referred to as all these names are by Hellenized names. So you often see her called Salome Alexandra with this Greek title. Anyway, she's from a very prominent lineage in her own right, and she marries first this brother, descendant of this guy, and then also a second brother. And so then out of their descendants, eventually we get Mariamne, who marries Herod. And now we see a different Arab line. This is Nabateans. Well, Idumeans, I talked about Edom earlier. A guy named Antipater marries a Nabatean noblewoman named Kypros, and their children actually are Herod and Salome the First. So one of the tangles I had to work through is a lot of the articles online mix up this Salome with that Salome. And then actually the wife of Herod, or one of the Herods, not this one, but a later Herod, is Herodias, and she has a daughter named Salome. So there's a lot of Salomes running loose in all of this. But anyway, who is Shlomtzion? So she was one of the great queens of Israel. And, really probably the only queen regnant, meaning that she was in full control of the political sphere. And so, she was hooked up with the Pharisees because of family ties. And the Pharisees, as I'll get into a little bit, were very much reviled in the Christian Bible because of arguments with Yeshua. Some people, however, say Yeshua had a lot of Pharisee qualities to them, including this business of debating the law in the temple. That's Pharisee stuff. Anyway, she marries these two brothers. The first brother put his other brother in prison, and we're going to see all this internecine conflict going on in this royal dynasty, murderous behavior toward each other, so that, I can be on the throne and you cannot. And so she rescues the other brother from prison and saves him and ends up marrying him. And then when he dies, she becomes queen, and you'll see coins of hers. And this is the Hasmonean symbol. I couldn't figure this out for a while, but they finally found something saying that these represent cornucopias that are intertwined, although they kind of look like torches also. But anyway, she rules in her own right for quite a time. But really, we have to go back to Sheila Michaels. And this is a old feminist, second wave feminist founder who really studied this way back. You can see this in the 90s. And so she says, she's ruling here for 11 years. She survived 2 murderous husbands, the elder of whom starved his mother to death in his dungeons. The second husband was forever grateful because she freed him from the dungeon when she had to choose one of her husband's brothers. A levirate marriage means that when the guy dies, when the husband dies, you got to marry one of his brothers. This is old Jewish law. But it was more than that. It was dynastic. They didn't want the woman to marry outside the family because they wanted to control the wealth and the lineage, the dynasty. So she's forced to marry. And this is the life story of all of these queens. Their brothers or their fathers forced them into these political marriage. But her husband's crucified hundreds of opponents, converted nations by the sword. We're going to see that in a second. But anyway, she instituted universal elementary education in Judea. And I had, when I was researching this elsewhere, they don't really mention was girls included or not, but Sheila found out that girls were initially included, but then that was dropped. And so she also built, some sources will say, well, her husband counseled her to get support from the Pharisees. She didn't need her husband to tell her that. She was already in with him. Her brother was the leading Pharisee in Jerusalem, okay? But why the Pharisees were important is that they were the popular form of Judaism. They are where rabbinical Judaism comes forth from. And then you have the tzaddikim, the Sadducees, as they're called, Sadducees in Greek, are the temple priests, and they are the elite, and they're the ones that are also very much in with the Romans, collaborating with the Romans. But anyway, she has this peaceful reign that was one of the golden ages. And so you can see the extent is greater of maybe more than the time of Solomon, although claims are made for this great empire of Solomon. But this was not territory she conquered. Her husband's conquered it, and she inherited this kingdom. And she was the last independent ruler, female or male, of this whole region. And you can see it incorporates part of what is now Jordan. Here's the Nabateans, and here's Idumea, which we're going to come back to. Oh, here we are. So Edom in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, and these are little stone altars. You've got the bull there. And so these are the southern desert regions, and ethnically, these are the children of Esau. When you've got Jacob, Yitzhak, and Esau in the Bible, these are the shepherd people because they are in the desert. And Nabatea is part of that region. Petra is part of that region. So there again, wait a minute, this is in the wrong place. I'm sorry, because the Salomes were mixed up, and this is much, much later. So let me skip over this. Well, I guess I'm not going to. What I'm going to do now is just say that the Nabatean families, this guy named Antipater the Idumean, marries a Nabatean woman, and their child is Herod. And so he founds a new dynasty. This is the Herodian dynasty. And they are just every much as oppressive and bloodthirsty as their predecessors. So Herod I forces his sister, Salome, to marry men for his own political objectives. And so, there's all these intrigues going on, and you'll see in the sources a lot of really misogynist. Oh, it was all Salome. She was terrible, and she fought with Mariamne, and she did, because Mariamne said, "You're an Arab. I don't want anything." They looked down on them. They weren't from the royal line of the Hasmoneans. So there was all this ethnic conflict involved in this. But anyway, Salome divorces her husband, which is really not something of Judaic custom. It may also have been a Nabatean influence, and takes a husband of her own choosing. So there's a lot of female independence. Nevertheless, this Salome gets her brother Herod to condemn Mariamne, her enemy, who was constantly, there's a lot in the literature about her, this whole family looking down on Salome because of her Nabatean background. And then you have another Salome, which is 2 generations down, the daughter of Herodias. And this is the figure in the Bible that you have this really awful story about the dance of Salome. And then her mother gets her, as her reward for the dance, to demand the head of John the Baptist. So, there's all this bias in the Christian text around that Salome. Okay, so all of this in the time of Herod and the following period, we have the Romans starting to come into the picture. They just got rid of the Seleucids from Syria rulership, and now here come the Romans, and partly because Herod made pacts with the Romans in order to stay in power himself. And he actually goes to Rome and appeals to them to install him as king, which they do. So he becomes the ethnarch of Judea and Samaria. So here's the looting of the temple in the year 70. The destruction of the second temple happens then. Only one wall is left standing. And you've got these coins of Judea Capta that are the Romans joyfully saying, we've conquered you. The country is pictured as a woman who is mourning and sitting under a palm tree most of the time, which becomes like a symbol of the Judean culture, either the palm leaf or the palm tree. And so Judea Capta, and we also have Judea Devicta, shown as a woman here now standing, but with her hands in shackles. So this defeated female as the symbol of the country that has been colonized and is basically being looted like all the other colonies by the Romans. And, people are being taken off into slavery, all those same patterns of Roman rulership. Meanwhile, all this is going on. You have the Qumran community, who are sometimes referred to as the Essenes. And there's been debates about them. This is the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest Jewish scriptures. There were others that were thought to be the oldest. When these were discovered in the late 20th century, then all of a sudden, wow, they discovered not only are these older chronologically, but there's not one version of Torah or the other books of the Tanakh, the other parts besides the 5 books of Moses in the Hebrew Bible. There are many versions. There's variation, and this caused a huge uproar because the whole story was there was this one divine revelation, and now look, there's all these versions, and which one is the authentic version? So the word Essenes is either derived from osioi, I think this comes from Josephus, which would have meant keelers if it was from Greek. But then in a Judaic interpretation, osei haTorah, the ones who observe or enact the Torah. So along comes this guy, Yeshua of Nazareth, this wandering sage. And of course, in the Christian version, we have the four Gospels, and they conflict, as this cartoon is showing us. But, what we have to realize with the whole Christian narrative is these are Aramaic speakers. Judea isn't really speaking Hebrew anymore, and especially in the north, they're speaking Aramaic, which is a Syriac language. But the Bible is written down in Greek, so we have several layers of distancing from these original teachings. A, they're all oral teachings. B, they're in Aramaic. C, they are written down in Greek by people, most of whom had not actually met this guy. Okay, so there's a lot of disconnects in all of this. And then we have also this whole ethnic thing. And now I'm coming more into sort of the later Christian constructs of, who was this Galilean? And so here's a modern visualization, not like what I'm about to show you. And here is one of the earliest images. This is a Roman mosaic, but this is what we have gotten from the Christianized narrative, which separates Yeshua from the entire Jewish community, which he really explicitly declares himself to be part of. Not only that, he says, I have come only for the lost sheep of Israel. So he's there to minister to Jewry. Okay, but we have all of this imagery of the Anglo-Saxon, the white Jewish. This is from the Jehovah's Witness. And, it's just completely a historical fabrication. In those Christian narratives, too, we have these elements of female submission, starting with the Virgin Mary receiving conception as the obedient handmaid of the Lord. This is a woman begging to be healed, maybe the woman who had effusions of blood and couldn't stop bleeding, and so begging to be healed. And this is the story pounded into the heads of countless generations of Martha and Mary. And Martha says, come on, Mary, you got to go help me in the kitchen because I'm doing all the work here. And Yeshua rebukes her and says, Mary belongs here. She is here to listen to the teachings and not to concern herself with, such trivial stuff as women's housework. And you even have quite a bit of blaming of the Jews for the execution of Yeshua. And so you get engravings like this. Christian art is full of this really anti-Semitic prototypes of, the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling council of the temple, the legal judiciary, actually, plotting to kill him. And this is what happens in the scriptures, the Gospels, is in varying levels, because they all tell it a little different way, but several of them blame they blame the Jewish authorities for going after Yeshua, and they completely let the Romans off the hook. And I was going to put more slides in this about this, but they'll be, I'm going to add another reading about this. Pontius Pilate was one of the most vicious Roman governors, and that is saying a lot. He crucified thousands and thousands of people in Palestine. He was just awful, and his own contemporaries attest to that. In fact, he's finally bumped out after several decades of terror. But he is made in the Christian scripture to wash his hands. They go, I don't really want to do anything. This man seems fine to me. And so they put it all on the Jewish authorities. And that's ignoring the fact that Rome crucified tens of thousands of people. There were Jewish revolts over and over again. It was like a famous region of rejecting Roman rulership. And so the crucifixions were also happening to slaves that were revolting in Sicily and in various parts of Italy under Spartacus, the various different other kinds of revolts that happened. But Judea was especially a place where, it wasn't just this one guy and the two thieves on either side of him. And one of those thieves, Barnabas, was referred to as a lestai, which is a word that means bandit, but it actually referred to the zealots who were resisting and attacking Romans. Meanwhile, what does life look like in this time period? So this is a revisualization of Jerusalem with its walls still intact, and a house of a Palestinian rabbi, and you can see the little clay oven there. Probably this was all plastered over the floor in that time. So, there's a whole thing that we can't even really entirely visualize about what life looked like there. But I'm going to stay with the political narrative for the moment, because then there's another revolt. 60 years after the temple is crushed, the Bar Kokhba revolt happens, and they have 3 years of self-rule during which they issue these coins. And, some of them have the temple and other kinds of icons on it. But then Rome kind of freaks out, because Bar Kokhba actually succeeds in wiping out a whole Roman legion. And Rome freaks out, and they call troops from every corner of the empire, from Britain and Gaul and North Africa, send them to Palestine to put down this revolt, which they do. Now, backing up a little bit, before the destruction of the temple, and these are all reconstructions, of course, but there was a women's court. Women could only enter the temple through the north and south gates. They couldn't enter through the main gate. And they had a segregated area that they belonged in. And this is kind of like, the gallery, what they call the gallery, which apparently did not originally exist, but eventually they built a gallery. And so the priest's area is here, the men's area is there, and the women would look over the heads of the men to see what was going on in the center. No, men weren't even allowed here except for the priests in the priestly court. So, there's the gallery, and these are another visualization of this. And so there's one midrash that says the gallery did not always exist, but was built to prevent the sexes from mixing in festivities. When Sukkot began, there were these water drawing ceremonies that were like playful and joyous and lots of celebration and carrying on. So that there's controversy over where did the segregation of women originate. But after the destruction of the temple, there's no more temple. And that was like sort of the pivotal center. And so you have the growth of synagogues, which means teaching together. Okay, now here, this is a modern engraving, so we can't necessarily say this is historic, that there was already a mechitza and a separate women's gallery, but the testimony on this is contradictory. And some sources say, yes, there was such a division. Others say, well, not until later. But we do know that the Therapeutai, which were an ecstatic Jewish sect in northern Egypt, did have a divider between the men and women's sections, and they dined separately from each other. So this sex segregation is something that appeared. It's just very hard to track exactly when and how it was happening. So then these synagogues start building up, and there start to be, more local centers for people to gather. And so this might be a palm leaf, might be a lulav, I'm not really sure. You've got the menorah, which is very ancient. We already see the menorah appearing in Palestinian temples around 1200 BCE. So this is like a symbolic tree of life that it has been around. It's like there's a through line there, a long one. And here the menorah as the almond tree. And so you see the doors of the temple here, or possibly this is meant to be the ark where the Torah is kept. But we also see pagan influences again, and particularly in the north. Sepphoris, Tsipori, it's very close to Nazareth, and it was a heavily Hellenized city. And so you've got these mosaics with goddesses going on, and people are speaking Greek in these regions. You have zodiac. This is Virgo. In the zodiac, there are zodiac mosaics. And now what I'm going to show you next, I just want to warn people, I don't mean to trigger anybody, but just to show the intense historical distortions that have happened over the last 2,000 years, you will see there were also mosaics created by Jews on the floor of synagogues with the swastika, because this is something that we know from the Zuni, from the Tibetans, from India, all kinds of different places around the world. It's basically the directions in motion, so it's a symbol of the time-space matrix, in a sense, you could consider it. And so En Gedi, this is an early layer of the synagogue at En Gedi, next to the Dead Sea. But we see others more Hellenistic in form here I'm assuming this is a synagogue in the north. And so you have the scallop forms and other things happening. And here's another one, and I don't know where this one is from, but again, right there with the menorah. So this is the torquing of history, the way that the appropriation of a symbol by the Nazis in the service of anti-Semitic domination and genocide is something that's a very late historical layer. And in a way, to me, this shows a unity in Jewish symbolism with other cultures that did not have any of that hatred attached to this symbol. And so here's another one. This is, again, going into that cross Jordan River connections, because the Hauran region is going over into Syria. But here again, the menorah. And these tie in also with the Greek key patterns. And I think Hellenistic influence would have been part of how those symbols came in. They weren't from more ancient times in Israel. So then you have the Talmud, so from the Pharisees grows the rabbinical movement, because their whole thing was interpretation of the law. And so the Mishnah and the Gemara, the various interpretations and commentaries rise up out of that. And you have two forms of this Talmud, both the Palestinian and the Babylonian Talmud. And that brings us to Beruriah. So she's in the early 2nd century of the modern era. And it said that she was an ingenious scholar. Her brother was not worthy, and so her father turned to her and taught her. And so she became this great sage. But structurally, she was kept out. She didn't have a lineage. She didn't belong to a rabbinical line. And, she's not named in the Palestinian Talmud in her own country at all, although she is in the Babylonian Talmud. There's a couple citations of her. And there's a saying here, I think this is Aramaic: Beruriah studied 300 laws by 300 sages in a single day. So there's a recognition of her genius. It's just there's not any place for a continuity of it, and not a lot of what she said survived because of that. But there are some citations about her, showing her as a wise woman who even instructs her husband. When her son dies, she conceals his death until Shabbat is over, and then says, God has entrusted something to us, and if someone entrusts something precious to you and asks for its return, should you return it? And Rabbi Meir says, yes, of course. And she says, all right, well, we have to return our son to God because he's been taken from us, right? But she is sometimes named in her own right as a scholar. And this is the best source that I recommend on, there's many great things that have been written, but I really love this article by Rachel Adler that really covers a lot of this, and especially things about the sexism she faced within the Talmudic community. There's a lot of really misogynist remarks and rulings in there. And so there's this one great story where she ridicules the patriarchal rabbi Jose Hakalili, and she basically caustically puts him in his place. So they meet, and he says, by what road do we go to Lydda? And she replies, foolish Galilean, didn't the sages say, converse not overmuch with women? You should have said, by which to Lydda? So, she's actually turning, she's turning their own weapons against them. Later on, you have sexual maligning, horrible, scurrilous stories about Beruriah having been seduced by a student of her husband, who had actually put the guy up to this. And this is all to discredit her. This is in a passage, Avodah Zarah, in the Talmud. But this is, and all in order to prove that women are lightheaded and flighty and not worthy of the true learning. But it does not appear until Rashi, and we don't have a written version of it until the 1300s. So this is not something that happened in her lifetime, but later on, as the misogyny begins to build up. Now, I want to come back again to the map, and I don't remember what I wanted to say about this map, but again, here, Jerusalem, here's Hebron, and we're going to look at another map. This little area right here is Beit Nattif. So on the larger map here, we can see that it's mostly west of Jerusalem. It's a little village up in the Judean hills in southern Judea. And down to the south is Hebron, which is another important center of traditions about Abraham and Sarah. This town, we're talking now about the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, had a workshop that was manufacturing mold-made terracottas. And so this is what I'm calling the icons of Beit Nattif. I first found pictures of these in the 90s in some article on Jewish, it was a book on Jewish history, and had a few of these photos, and I had never seen them anywhere. And it took me decades to find more photos of them. So these are from photocopies I took in this Jewish library in San Francisco. So you can see very well that they're mold made. And you've got these tall headdresses, the arms raised in invocation. And here's the thing about these is that they're really overlooked is too light of a word. They are passed over by most sources until very recently. So you will see a lot of references to the lamp workshop at Beit Nattif, and the lamps manufactured there wound up all over the country and across the Jordan River. People were trading them. And occasionally you might see a vague reference to nude females, but that's it. And the majesty of these figurines is just completely left out, and it does not appear in surveys, archaeological surveys. I've never seen it in any books except for specific studies about Beit Nattif. So here we've got a mold-made figurine. She's got her arms raised either in benediction or invocation. Some people say these circular objects that she's holding could be drums or mirrors, maybe rattles. I want you to notice this headdress. We're going to see the same headdress with the veil wrapped behind it in numerous examples. And so also pendant, either sides to the headdress or pendant jewels hanging off them. She also has little circular objects in her hands. We don't know what those were. Here's a nice rare color photograph. But this headdress, is it a tree of life? It looks a lot like the layered horned headdresses in Mesopotamia, starting with the Sumerians, but especially the Akkadians and Babylonians. The gods and goddesses this is the sign that shows you're dealing with a deity, because they're wearing this horned headdress. And so because there were Mesopotamian influences flowing all around Southwestern Asia, it's possible that this is a memory of that, which would tend to mark them as deities. Well, here's another one, a comparison where you have, this is an Ishtar of Eshnunna. This is, I think, maybe Akkadian period, but you see the similarity in these tipped lines, except here they've become straight. On this one, they were still curved, but they look more tree-like there. So I'm just laying this out as a possible influence, because one of the things we see are through lines over long periods of time where certain iconographic features continue to reappear. And so here's more examples of that tall headdress with those markings. And also we have a group of figurines that really emphasize motherhood. So hands on a pregnant belly, you have sometimes a child in arms. And another thing I want to remark upon is the characteristic style of rendering faces, which is really very much formalized in Beit Nattif iconography. You have the brow and the nose. You do not have eyes. It's just smooth there. And this is, if we go back through these, all of them are like that. Well, this one actually does have a little bit of eyes. But, as I go along, you're going to see this over and over again. And this is a signature style that I've only ever seen at Beit Nattif, with one exception, which we'll come to. And you can see a lot of these are fragmentary because these are the discards that were cast off by the workshop because they're broken. And so they threw them into a pit, and that's where this huge trove was found. There are other examples. Some were found in caves outside of Jerusalem, various other sites. They're scattered in a few other places, but this is our main surviving testimony to the existence of this. And think how late this is for female figurines. We're talking about the 200s, maybe into the 300s of the so-called Christian era. Then again, some of them are also in shrines. Here I'm looking at two different pictures of the same thing. And you can see the wheat ear in the gable of the archway she's standing in. This is a symbolism that is very old in the region, but the form it's taking here is influenced by the Greco-Roman styles, even though the figures are not. But these columns, this is called an aedicula in Latin. And you see examples of these a lot in Petra and other places too. But the style has nothing to do with Hellenistic or Roman iconography. So what do we have? We have a woman who is not wearing any clothing. She's got a headdress, necklace, usually leggings, leg bands, sometimes armbands or bracelets, and she's cupping one breast and she has the other hand, you can see it a little better here, on her belly. So the iconography of the life giver, the breast as the giver of milk, the hand over the belly as the progenitrix. Were these goddesses? It sure looks like it because normally that's who you see inside of these aedicula. Okay, these look alike, but if you examine them closely, they're different, small differences in modeling. So that I know of 3 examples of these shrine forms with a goddess inside of it. Sometimes it looks like there might be a cup in her hand, but as we look at them, we're going to see it's just her thumb cupping her breast. And this is a very characteristic gesture in breastfeeding, is to hold the breast in such a way that you can angle the nipple into the child's mouth. But these terracotta shrines go all the way back into the early Iron Age, and they're found in Jordan, in Israel, and in Lebanon. And usually they're empty. So there's the idea that you could place an icon inside of them. Maybe these were made by artisans and then were sold to people. We don't know really much about that. Or it could simply be an aniconic shrine where you place offerings inside of them to the household deity, to perhaps the teraphim in ancient times that are referred to in the Bible, the biblical name for the goddess figurines or the female figurines. These with birds, and you have also human-headed birds and lions, and this all very much tracks with Judaic iconography. But you've got the breastfeeding and the child at the breast, and here again the hand. See the way her finger is angled, those 2 fingers holding the nipple to the child's mouth. That's classic. And any of these are broken. You can see how they're hollow. Here's a really good example where you can see that's her thumb, not a cup. Hand to the belly. The thumb here almost looks, I don't know, it's a very thin thumb. But so this goes on. This is like a total theme in the iconography. It goes back in time. This is Megiddo in the Canaanite period or slightly after that. And we have the same kind of naked female figure with necklace. Can't really see much, they're broken, so headdress doesn't really show up. But the exact same gesture of one hand to the breast and the other to the belly or even to the vulva. And this is an offering stand from Megiddo. So they would place a bowl on top to receive offerings. And these terracotta offering stands are a whole study in themselves, which, in the Hebrew goddess presentation, which I'm going to make a stream on demand as soon as I can, that will appear again. But here I'm just drawing parallels back to that period. Figurine from Megiddo, woman with drum in her hand. The same kind of formation, though. It's a figure of a naked woman with many leg bands, probably ornaments on the broken head as well. You see this one has a necklace. And she is, the legs are like sort of de-emphasized. They're shorter than the rest of the body. It's kind of telescoped legs. This is a style that already existed a long time ago. And here's an example from Petra, who also seems to have the drum in the period that we're looking at with Beit Nattif. So there's a through line here. Anyway, we got many broken heads and the faces in that characteristic style that only appears here. Here's another broken figurine, headless, with the hands in that characteristic gesture. And the peaked headdresses, which I'm going to come to next, these are something also that have a historic continuity. Well, here's a couple examples. The upper part is broken off, but these anklets are something that reoccur and are continuous from the late Bronze Age period. Now here's the one example I referred to that is found outside of historic Israel from Jordan. And it's in the Beit Nattif style, the way the face is figured in particular. The rest of it, a woman sitting side saddle on a horse, or really enthroned. I mean, you don't really ride like this. She's enthroned on a horse, and the horse has maybe a human head on it as well. So was this made in Jordan, and does it indicate Jordanian influences on Beit Nattif? That's a possibility. It's also possible that this was traded to Jordan out of the workshop from Beit Nattif. But this is why I was talking earlier about the Idumeans. Let's see, I don't know what I have next here in this slide. I'll just refer to it here, is because in the Hasmonean conquests, they conquer Idumea, which is what we would now call the Negev and the area south of the Black Sea, the Dead Sea, and going over into the Nabatean region where Petra is. They forcibly converted under Yohanan Hyrcaneos. They forcibly converted these basic Arab-speaking populations, the Edomites, to Judaism. And a bunch of them emigrated into the area that we're calling Idumea, south of Judah. So there is this other ethnic presence going on, and it's possible that these were the people who were the artisans actually making the mold-made figurines. There's a whole argument about whether the Jews in southern Judea at that time were still very much involved in veneration of the female divine, in spite of all the other historical events that have taken place, or whether this was a foreign influence brought in that was participated in because Jews were actually buying these and using them. They were being placed in funerary caves in Jerusalem, so there's a lot of question marks here. Here's some examples of actual Judaic content. There aren't a lot, but there are menorah lamps that were being created at Beit Nattif. And so the question is, were they created for a Jewish market entirely by Jewish makers, or were they created because there was a market for them, but it wasn't really what this community was into? But the other thing that does point to a Judaic content is there are male riders, and again, on horses that have human faces. So like magical steeds, I guess, as we could describe it. And in the literature of the period, the Messiah literature often refers to a male rider, maybe even the Moshiach himself appearing as a rider to come and redeem Judea. So that's a possibility as well, but we're seeing it in this iconography. And so you can see there's lots of these. This took me 35 years at least to find all of these photos. Now I want to come back to the headdresses. We saw earlier on the very tall peaked headdress that we also see in Syria, although this one's not as tall, even all the way over to Hatra in the Parthian Empire. This is one that's carved out of chalk that is from within the borders of Judea. So these exist, but what we know is that there is a continuity here also to the traditional dress of Palestinian women. And so the kind of a hat, a crown that is draped over by the veil. And the veil was not traditionally, not until quite recently, a face veil in Palestine. It was a head veil, which was something that existed since the biblical times. So you see in various regions, the women of Ramallah have one style, in Beit Lahem they have another style, but you can see a continuity in those headdresses. And here's the base of it. So in Beit Lahem, they call it the shatwe, or the tarbush. Tarbush is like a fez, but women wore the tarbush as well as men. And so you have this crown, this conical crown, placed over the head, and then the veil draped over it. And the pendants that are on the sides of many of these are also reminiscent of these flaps that you see on the Beit Nattif headdresses. In the late period, and we don't know really, people will usually say this is Ottoman influence, where you have the coins added to the tarbush, to the shatwe, as the woman's dowry. She would wear her dowry. Okay, this is her personal wealth. And so it might have been Ottoman influence, although it's possible that there's an earlier Arabian influence in that wearing of the coins. At any rate, you see a really strong correspondence in the styles of headdress topped by veil here in Ramallah, and then over here all the way up in Palmyra in Syria. So there's quite a bit of connection there. And we have to remember Aramaic, which is a Syriac language, was spoken in Judea and in Galilee. Yeshua of Nazareth They all spoke Aramaic. Okay. But anyway, just continuation. Here's another form of the headdress that is reflective of some of the styles that we see in Beit Nattif. One more thing about this roiling mixture of religious themes is this Mamre pilgrim mold. This is from just north of Hebron in southern Judea. And one side I'm not showing you here has the story of Abraham having the appearance of three angels coming to announce to him that he is going to become the father of the nation, of this great nation that is coming, which is the Jewish nation. But on the other side is the goddess, Atar goddess, the dea Syria, with her polos headdress and flanked by the ears of wheat, just like she appears in various Jordanian temples and all the way up into Syria. So there is a mixture. And in fact, this shrine, you have Jews, Christians, and pagans all coming to the well at Mamre as a holy place. And so the mold-made figurines continue as late as the 5th century. They've long since Christianized the entire Roman Empire, which means they made a decree. They didn't actually succeed in Christianizing everybody, and especially not Gaza. Gaza was famously a stronghold of pagan religion. There was a temple that was dismantled by the Byzantine rulers, and they made roads out of it, and the pagans refused to walk on the road. So, these resistance. And when the bishop came to visit, they were burning noxious substances and, resisting. But here again, we see that same gesture of the hand spreading the fingers so the nipple can guide to the mouth of the child. And those two sites are pretty far apart. This is from Gaza. This is from Bet Sha'an, which is way up north, further north. Anyway, we have the diaspora happens and the exile and people thrown out of the country by the Romans, especially after the final victory of the empire over the Bar Kokhba revolt. They marched many tens of thousands off into slavery across the empire, and others fled into exile and wind up scattered around the Mediterranean. And so the Talmud says, wheresoever they were exiled, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, went with them. And so a carrying of those traditions. But in modern history, then we have other exiles with the Nakba and the expulsion of Palestinians from many cities and villages across the country. And one of those places was Beit Nattif. And so on October 21st in 1948, Operation Hahar expelled everybody out of the town and took it over. And this happened to many Palestinian towns. So this is the genesis of what we're seeing now, a continuation of that. But the spark of hope is going back before the patriarchal religions. There is a common heritage because all of these people are of Canaanite descent. They have linguistic and symbolic and even genomic connections to the ancestral cultures of Canaan. We have from Megiddo, the ivory. We have a seal. It's actually a scarab from the Iron Age period. And then we can go all the way back to the Yarmouktian and the other Neolithic cultures in the region before any of these ethnicities had even been named. And interestingly enough, even there, we have the iconography of one hand to the breast and the other to the belly.